Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Althea Mackenzie. Welcome to the summary of the second in our Cadmium Talk series. We have had two very engaging conversations in the series thus far, and we're happy to bring you a synopsis of the second webinar, which was held on Tuesday, October 31, 2023. This engagement is part of the project from the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, ICA, and the International Cocoa Organization, ICCO, improving capacity building and knowledge sharing to support the management of cadmium levels in cocoa in Latin America and the Caribbean for export to the European region. The project aims to support cocoa-producing countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, LAC, meet the 2019 European regulation and others to follow that set maximum levels for cadmium in cocoa and chocolate products. To tell us more, here is Dr. Elizabeth Johnson, Project Lead.
The project is all about helping our cocoa sectors in Latin America and the Caribbean to control or to minimize cadmium contamination in the entire value chain, across the entire value chain. Cadmium Talks is one component of the awareness raising program. And we are really pleased to be able to bring this information to you. We invite specialists and in their fields to discuss the topics with you.
As Dr. Johnson points out, we engage some of the best experts in the field to share their wealth of knowledge with you, and so we now move to some of the information shared by the presenters in Webinar 2. First up were Kevin Carrillo Montoya and his colleague Luis Fernando Solano Jimenez, agricultural engineers. Both gentlemen work with the Institute of Innovation and Agricultural Technology Transfer, INTA, in Costa Rica. And so their presentation focused on the work being done by INTA to raise awareness about cadmium levels in cocoa in Costa Rica. Let's now hear from Kevin Carrillo Montoya, whose presentation focused on the factors that impact cadmium levels in cocoa.
As you will know, cadmium occurs naturally in the atmosphere and the soil. Some studies have shown that geology also has a significant effect on the chemical characteristics of the soil, which is formed because of that variable. And some geological materials may have more cadmium than others. Other factors that were mentioned are irrigation water. This has happened in some farms in plain land, and atmospheric deposition, which act together with agricultural factors which affect the plant uptake. So it is important to bear in mind that this is a combination of processes. That is, we are going to see that cadmium is not the result of a single factor. The problem is a bit more complex. So factors which affect cadmium concentrations in beans, as we could see, factors interact with each other. For example, cadmium is present in soil and it will enter the plant. Many studies agree on the importance of the soil pH and the soil organic carbon, which also controls the levels of cadmium.
That was Kevin Carrillo Montoya, highlighting some of the factors that impact cadmium levels in cocoa. His colleague, Luis Fernando Solano Jimenez, then spoke about genetics and how this impacts cadmium levels in cocoa.
The cocoa crop has a high genetic variability, and this triggers different characteristics, both morphologically, the color of fruits, flavor, and the sensory quality, as well as plant structure, resistant to disease, and nutrient uptake. It has also been found that in terms of cadmium, there are differences in uptake and even in distribution in different parts of the plant. So different studies have even shown differences of between 5 and 15 times the cadmium concentration in leaves. These are studies in controlled conditions. These studies were carried out in hydroponics and in soil with homogeneous conditions. In the case of the research in Costa Rica, we used homogeneous soil conditions and recent research that we have just finished in hydroponics. Part of these results show a difference of 5 times between different genotypes with higher and lower uptake with regard to cadmium concentration.
Now, having heard the revelations from INTA about the factors and variabilities, including genetics, that impact the levels of cadmium in the soil in Costa Rica, it was then time for the presentations on cadmium cocoa beans and the market. From Christina, Rohsius, head of Cocoa Quality Department at Roush GmbH, and Marc, Joncheere, EMEA Pesticides and Contaminants Regulatory Expert who works closely with Cargill Incorporated. First up for these presentations was Christina.
The Roush company has produces the Roush plantation chocolates. That's single origin, non-mixed chocolates from 8 different countries. And we have a huge chocolate house in Berlin, which is our flagship store, where we have around 1 million visitors per year. And we have our own plantation in Costa Rica, a small plantation where we do our scientific work and try to find out what is the easiest way to produce cocoa. So in total, we're not only sourcing and producing chocolates, but we also farm cocoa. The quality of this cocoa chain is very diverse in the different countries. We have different regulations and also different situations that we face. In order to obtain a good quality for all the chocolates, we have to analyze the cocoa in the different commodity chain at different steps. And that's something I would like to show here. It is very, very important for us to have reliable partners. Most of the partners where we source the cocoa from, we know from around 10, 15 years already. And what we do to make sure that the quality, and this means the cadmium levels, for example, are low, is that we go into the field, we make soil samples, we analyze the fertilizers, and we analyze the different plant parts. And only if we are sure that this farm is suitable as a long-term partner, we would go and buy. And before we would receive the first container, we would usually, that's always the time, get a pre-shipment sample, which is being analyzed in terms of cadmium, but also pesticides and the aroma potential. And after the transport has happened, before the cocoa goes into the warehouse, we would have 30% of the cocoa being sampled and have an arbitrage sample. And this is going to be analyzed again. And after this cocoa from the warehouse goes into the processing, it needs to be sampled again. This time it is a deshelled cocoa bean sample. So we have a third sampling of cocoa lot. And once these cocoa beans are processed into cocoa liquor, again, we would have a sampling and we would have an analysis of the cocoa cadmium content. And when the cocoa liquor is produced into a chocolate bar, again, we will have to analyze the chocolate bar. And depending whether the chocolate bar is for Roush or for the retailer, which are actually totally separate segments, totally separate companies, so totally separate cocoa beans also, they are analyzed by the retail, normally themselves, because they are responsible for the quality that they're selling. But we ourselves in the chocolate house also do our own testing again. So there's another analysis being conducted.
Christina Rohsius there with valuable information about how careful chocolatiers are along the value chain, which is very important in the marketing of their products. And now it's time for us to hear from Marc Joncheere.
Cadmium is a contaminant, but under the European regulation, there is a clear distinction between pesticides and contaminants, and it is of importance. And that's why I just saw one slide on this, because there are two framework regulation. The one that covers, there are several, in fact, on the pesticides, but the main one is on the maximum residue levels for pesticides, and that is, let's say, Regulation 396/2005. That's an umbrella regulation, a framework regulation. And on the other hand, we have the regulation on contaminants, which was formerly known as the 1881/2006, but that has been put to rest. And now the regulation, the number is 2023/915. And so you can park pesticides respectively under one umbrella and the contaminants on the other side. And there you see popping up our cadmium. And why do I say this difference? Because it is of capital importance. For the pesticides, the maximum residue levels, they are set on the raw agricultural commodity. In our case, it's on the cocoa beans after the removal of the shell. So, and there you can find all the data, the links, because the webinar, the presentations will be shared, and you have the links. And for pesticides, this is just one example of some products, and you see the levels are set on the cocoa beans in this case. And here you see for some examples an insecticide, a herbicide, and also a fungicide. Anyway, what does it mean? In the European Union, a food business operator is not allowed to blend parcels of non-compliant cocoa beans with parcels that would be compliant in terms of pesticides. That is forbidden by law. Am I saying? And it's this the number here, the regulation 178/2002, that's the general food law, that is not allowed. You have not that freedom to operate. That's for pesticides. As I mentioned, here we talk about contaminants. And for contaminants, the levels are set on a specific category. And that is listed all in the regulations. So it's not the same approach as for the pesticides. And for instance, here, for cadmium, we immediately see the levels that are being set in the European Union are on chocolate types, various chocolate types, and, for instance, also on cocoa powder. But I will come back to that later. But here you see, as the levels are set on a processed product, this means the food business operator has the freedom to move, to blend, to mix, let's say, parcels of cocoa beans, to, as long as the manufactured cocoa powder or the manufactured chocolate is compliant. So if we look at the levels that are prevail, so, and probably well known to the audience here, this is in the European Union, the levels that are set since 1st Jan 2019, after 5 years of discussions. And so, and these are the ones. And you see for various types of chocolates, whether it's a milk chocolate or depending on the cocoa solid content of your chocolate type, you have various levels. And also at the bottom, you see cocoa powder, the level, and this I'm going to push away. Cocoa powder, you see the level is 0.60. Please note, the level is 0.60 milligram per kilo, not 0.6. Every digit counts. If you would have a cocoa powder with a level of 0.62, that would be non-compliant. So the figures, the digits behind the comma are of importance. It's worth mentioning also what is cooking at the Codex level, at the international level. Codex is a joint committee of the World Trade Organization on the one hand and of the Food and Agriculture Organization on the other hand. And at Codex level, they are also levels set. Some are carved in stone already. For the chocolate types, all the discussions have been finished and the levels have been confirmed. And so you see, if you look at the Codex levels for different types of chocolate, more or less aligned to the EU levels, the levels set at Codex level are slightly more comfortable, if I may say, compared to the levels set at EU level. So that is, but they are, let's say, more or less aligned, especially if you get the higher cocoa content chocolates, that's more or less aligned.
Wow, that was really important information shared there by Marc about the regulations that govern acceptable levels of cadmium in cocoa. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear that if cocoa producers in the Caribbean and the Latin American region are to compete with other producers worldwide, we must ensure that cocoa that is being produced in the region gets into the European market with safe cadmium levels. On our next program, we will share information on what is considered safe levels of cadmium in cocoa, and we will also introduce experts who will share their stories of how they have been working in the field with farmers in the Latin American Caribbean region to help them reduce cadmium levels in the cocoa so that from field to fork, there is greater control. A big thank you to our sponsors and partners. This work is made possible through project grant funding and support provided by the STDF and the 11th EDF of the European Union.